Alright, in the last video we talked about the condition of slaves in the antebellum South. This next section of notes that you should have in front of you talks about the attitudes of whites and free blacks in the antebellum South. So we want to cover that next. And you should be able to begin to see how society was structured with three different groups: slaves, freed blacks, and whites in the antebellum South. Now, things like Nat Turner's Revolt and the Stonewall Rebellion in the South really put a lot of fear into the whites who were living in the South at the time. They were afraid not only of slave revolts in large numbers, but they were also afraid of actions of slaves against their individual masters. And we talked about that today in class, about dogs sleeping outside in order to guard the masters, and the slaves sleeping, or the dogs sleeping inside, and the slaves who were forced to sleep in separate buildings and were forced to sleep away from the house, so that the slaves could not harm the masters while they were asleep. Now, that was in order to protect them physically. In order to protect the institution of slavery in the minds of the owners, slavery begins to be justified by scientists and by sociologists and anthropologists. Anthropologists are people who study the life of man, and sociologists are people who study societies, man in groups. And these sociologists and scientists, doctors, all tried to put forward, at least in the South, the idea that whites were physically and mentally superior to the slaves that they kept. Slaves were... It was commonly believed that slaves could not think for themselves, that slaves were incapable of being educated. Now, this is kind of a self-fulfilling argument, since slaves were prevented from being educated, and then they were told that they were physically incapable of being educated. And the proof of that was that they weren't educated. So it's kind of that cyclical logic that we have going on. Now, only a quarter of white Southerners owned slaves or belonged to slave-owning families. 2/3 of those slave owners owned less than 100 slaves each, or owned less than 10 slaves each, and the vast minority of slave owners owned more than 5. 75% of white Southerners owned no slaves at all. They were mainly subsistence farmers, and that would be in that northern part of what would become the Confederacy, as we discussed in the last video among the border states. But they defended the slave policies because, A, it was the goal of every good Southern farmer to be wealthy enough in order to own slaves, and B, the poor Southern whites could see themselves as being greater than the slaves. So they may not be equal to, in society, the white rich landowners, but they could at least put themselves above the condition of slaves. And so it was by promoting the slave culture that they were able to make themselves feel better than the lowly slave. It was also believed that by mixing races, that whites would be degraded, that white people's children, if you had a child with a slave, then that child would not be as good as the white people around him. And so slavery was promoted as a way of keeping the races separate. We didn't want slaves mixing with whites because instead of that mixing improving genetically the people who would come after, it was seen as bringing down the whites. And so we very early on see that race mixing was very frowned upon. Mountain whites, as your notes talk about, were small independent farmers very far removed from the cotton kingdom of the South. West Virginia, northern Georgia, northern Alabama. These were places where cotton really didn't grow, and that the people were just subsistence farmers, which meant that they were farming pretty much just to support themselves and their families. They weren't making great profits off of subsistence farming. Most of these subsistence farmers were in favor of the Union, and this really hurt the Southern cause during the Civil War, as we'll see. Now, when it comes to free blacks, there were about 250,000 free blacks in the South by 1860, and these free blacks lived in constant fear of being taken by slave traders, being taken by runaway slave hunters, and being forced into slavery, which is not what their natural condition was. Now, the whites wanted to keep the freed blacks in the South as segregated because they didn't want the idea to get in their slaves' head that they actually did have other options other than slavery. In the border South, emancipation, as in freeing your slaves when you died or freeing your slaves when you could afford it, was much more common than it was in the lower South. Many freed blacks in the lower South were what were known as mulattoes, which meant that you had a white father and a black mother. But remember that law of the womb from 1650 in Virginia said that if your mother was a slave, then you were also a slave. Some very early on in the early 1800s, just after the Revolution, were able to purchase their freedom, but that became less and less frequent as time went on. In New Orleans, though, it was very common for slaves to own, for former slaves or for freed blacks to own slaves themselves. And in New Orleans, we see a great population of freed blacks living in equality and great prosperity. In the South, though, the color of your skin determined what rights you had. Blacks could not testify against a white person in court. They couldn't sit on juries. Blacks couldn't become teachers. They couldn't hold a number of jobs that would put them in positions of responsibility. And they were always, because they were feared of what a symbol they might become to the slaves already there. In the North, discrimination was pretty rampant. Irish hated the immigrants. Irish immigrants hated the freed blacks because they were in competition for the same jobs. And a lot of northern settlement was against the spread of slavery due to race prejudice rather than humanitarianism. People didn't want slavery to spread in the territories in order to guarantee for the jobs for themselves, not because they were against the institution of slavery, really. In the next section, we're going to take a look at early abolitionism, and we're going to take a look at the different movements that tried to either end slavery or prevent slavery from spreading. So what you need to know from this is that there were two groups of whites in the South: the rich whites who owned lots of slaves, the majority of whites who either owned few slaves or no slaves at all, and that there were two groups of blacks in the South. There were the free blacks, and then there were the slaves. And freed blacks really didn't have that much freedom, except in certain locations, but were kept separate for the majority of the time. So go ahead and read over these notes again, take the quiz over this section of notes, and we will see you tomorrow.